So this is going to be the lecture on Chapter 14, Architecture. These are the learning objectives. Take a look at those at the beginning of the chapter in your book. We're going to be talking about, the characteristics of traditional architectural methods and materials. We'll talk about how modern materials such as concrete and steel have changed architecture, and we'll talk about recent innovations in construction techniques and materials and how that has developed new architectural forms. And then we'll also talk about environmental concerns and how those new environmental concerns have impacted modern architecture. So some of the first architecture that we can see are called dolmens, and it's a type of single chamber megalithic tomb. And megalithic means large stone. And they usually consist of two vertical, megalithic stones supporting a horizontal capstone or table. So they kind of look like tables. And they are constructed from these large boulders, and typically the space inside is used as a tomb. So this is not a living area for people. It's not a house. It's a tomb for the dead. And you can see these structures throughout the world. They look very similar with the two upright megalithic stones and then the one on top. You can find them in France, India, Korea. So there's a pretty large distribution area that you might find these in. A large part of the world has these types of structures that are called dolmens. And these structures are doing more than just providing shelter for the average Joe at the time that they were built. So architecture is not just for making shelter, and it's actually defined as the art and science of designing, and constructing spaces, not only for the practical purposes, but also for symbolic purposes or aesthetic purposes. And it's just like any other art form in that way. So there's more to architecture than just the practical providing shelter to people. It's an art form, and it does have the potential to influence our daily lives. We spend a lot of time indoors, so we are influenced by the spaces that we reside in, and really does have the potential to be expressive as well, just like any other art form. So architects, when they build structures, they have to think of these three basic issues. Function is how the building is going to be used. Form is how is the building going to look. And then structure, how is it going to stand up? If it's beautiful in form, which is how it looks, or in, if it has an innovative structure, which is how it stands up, it's considered important architecture. So basically these two things consider, if they do a good job with either of these things or both of these things, as far as it's considered important architecture. Function has basically stayed the same for the most part. So in this lecture, we're actually going to go over some of the basic, engineering methods that have been used throughout the history of architecture. Some of the really basic stuff, the early stuff is very basic. So we'll go over some of that, and then we'll go into the more modern, high-tech stuff later on in the chapter. So architecture, architects really have to think about, how they design their buildings, and the buildings need to withstand physical forces of compression, tension, and bending or flexing, or all three of these different forces. So it could be a combination of those that they need to be able to withstand. And if they are all dealt with by the architect designing the building, it will actually be a stable structure. So there's basically three ways of constructing almost any building. The load-bearing method of piling rocks up on top of each other. The skeletal method, which involves erecting kind of a framework and then wrapping it in a skin of some kind. Or the molding method, in which like liquid, so concrete or mud, is poured into a mold and allowed to harden. And sometimes buildings use all three of these. So maybe, you might use the molding method for building the foundation of a house. So you pour the concrete, let that harden, and then you might use the skeletal method to erect the walls of the house out of 2x4s, and then you wrap that in an outer skin of siding, and on the interior of the house you would use like sheetrock. So it might be a combination of those three. So in ancient times we were nomadic, hunter-gatherers, and we did require a certain type of structure because of that lifestyle. But also early people had to rely on materials that they had available in their local area because they didn't have extensive trade routes like we do today. So architecture during that time consisted of caves wherever they might have been available. Sometimes they weren't available. Huts or tents made from wood and animal hide or maybe mud. Because early designers made structures only out of materials that were at hand, regional styles developed, and that was a result of the landscape, the climate, and the culture that was present there. And like I said, the early people didn't do a ton of trading, so regional styles did become very distinct at this time. So with time, society became more agricultural. We adopted animal husbandry, and society started building more permanent structures, which is what we have today. We have structures that are definitely more permanent, and that's because we don't follow around the herds of animals like the hunter-gatherers did. So we live in cities, we have jobs, we stay in the same place, and we're not actually limited to the materials that we use to build structures anymore, at least not as much, because we have a global trade system now. And that allows us to build pretty much whatever we want out of whatever we want, as long as we have the money. So there's a difference between back in the, in early buildings, there was a strong regional style, whereas the more modern buildings, there's not as much of a regional style now because of the trade networks and the modern technology that we have and the modern transportation systems that we have now. So probably a skyscraper in Italy is going to resemble the skyscraper in New York. There might be a few regional influences on those buildings, but for the most part, they're not going to look a ton different. So traditional materials include wood, stone, earth, and brick. Each have their own pros and cons. Wood is lightweight, so it's commonly used for like a roof beam, because you want your roof to be light, right? Stone is quite heavy, so it's great for load-bearing walls, but it can't be used for a roof beam because it's just too heavy. Earth is everywhere, but it lacks strength. Brick is strong, but it's very labor-intensive and time-consuming, and time-consuming equals money, right? So it's expensive. Out of all these materials, stone is thought to be the most commonly used material out there throughout the ages. The book states that most of the world's architecture was constructed of stone, especially the earlier stuff, the earlier architecture that we look at, that we will look at. But really, if we're looking way back in time, there were probably some impressive wooden structures as well, but they wouldn't have survived into present day because wood is not a permanent material. So all we have to look at is stone. Wood decays, so we don't really have evidence of wood as being an early structural material, but I bet they probably did use wood more than we realize. But it's commonly thought that stone was used because of its permanence and beauty. And it's also available everywhere, typically. So we'll talk about dry masonry. Dry masonry is basically piling stones on top of one another. And it's one of the simplest building techniques out there. It's probably one of the oldest building techniques out there. Just like the dolmen that we looked at earlier, it's a form of this technique of piling stones. It's just very simplified. But when stones are piled in a consistent pattern, the result is called masonry. Dry masonry does not use mortar between the stones. The weight of the stone actually holds the structure up. When stones are shaped or cut before they are stacked, this means they're dressed. So a dressed stone is shaped before it's placed in the fabric of the wall that is created, basically. So we'll take a look at the Great Zimbabwe in Zimbabwe, Africa. So here it is. This is before 1450. And the height of the walls is around 30 feet. That's at probably the tallest, I believe. So this is the plan. It's a circular building, as you can see, and then there's a few other circular structures inside. We'll take a look at the outside of the building here. So, Zimbabwe is a landlocked country that is considered to be in South Africa or Southern Africa. So it uses dressed masonry because the blocks are shaped before they are placed to create the walls. And it has this, the structure itself has an elliptical form, and it's made of local stone, probably built in 1350 or 1450 CE. And it's thought to have been used for around 300 years. So it has a long usage history where it was actually used. It does feature these cone-shaped structures, and we don't know what those were used for exactly. The walls are around 30 feet high and built up to 15 feet wide at the base. And then they taper in width as you go up. So they're getting lighter at the top because they're thinner, and then they're thicker. And that's probably just to account for the weight of the actual structure. They think the roof was probably grass or thatch mixed with, wood. And it was built in a city of around 20,000 people at the height of the city anyway. Around 20,000 people lived there. And there are openings for an entrance and an exit, but there are no windows. And that's probably because windows, once you add those into the walls, that will actually weaken the wall. And they might have not had the technology at the time to add in windows. And this is the largest stone structure in Africa south of the Great Pyramids of Egypt, which were also built using dry masonry technique, no mortar in between the stones. Machu Picchu in Peru was also built with dry masonry, and so was Mesa Verde in the southwestern United States. So, some early structures that are using dry masonry. It's a very early technique for building. Let's see how much time we have. We have a few minutes, so I'll keep going. So another, method which is considered traditional is the post and beam or post and lintel technique. And we kind of saw this with the dolmens, but it's been used to build much of the world's architecture. And it's basically consists of the two vertical pieces, which are called posts, or sometimes columns are used. But they're called post, the two vertical pieces, and then basically a horizontal piece that is stacked on top, which is called a beam or lintel, and the posts carry the weight of the structure into the ground. So the vertical supports carry the weight of the structure into the ground. Stone beams are heavy and brittle, and so their length has to be a lot shorter. Wood beams can be longer and thinner because it's lighter and more flexible than wood is. So let's take a look at that post and beam construction. This is kind of what it looks like. We have the vertical posts and then the lintel or beam. You can see how the weight pushes down there. A row of columns is called a colonnade, and we can see an example of a colonnade in the court of Amenhotep III, and we'll take a look at that in the next video.